Ours is a spiritual tradition that has always venerated inquiry. In fact, we have venerated inquiry above such typical religious concepts as faith, obedience, unquestioning acceptance. Remember our claimed venerables: Susan B. Anthony, who questioned male authority; Daniel Ellsberg, who questioned government secrecy; Ralph Waldo Emerson, who questioned theological assumptions; Miguel Servetus, who questioned biblical literalism; the wandering preacher from Galilee, who questioned the conspiratorial oppression of public rule and religious ritual laws; the ancient priestess, who questioned nature as only understood through a lens of dominion; and even you, here, today, whose presence show that at some point you chose to ask questions more than just receive answers. The old joke has told us that you knew you were dealing with religious liberals because they were the ones who put burning question marks on your front lawns. We seek to emulate those who use critical thought as a scalpel of truth to cut through superstition and oppression. Galileo trusted his own discerning observations and reflections more than any of the canons of the Church. Jan Hus trusted his sense of love and connection more than all the ecclesiology of the established and establishment church. Anne Hutchinson trusted her intuitive sense of our innate and free access to such divinity as may speak to our hearts, minds, and spirits more than any religious elders could forbid. These were inquiring minds who would face condemnation, exile, even death, rather than surrender their human capacity to reach beyond the given into the possible in search of a truer understanding of the true. Yes, we are the people, we are the tradition, we are a congregation of inquiry. Or are we? We have this long heritage of asking certain questions. For us, one of the sacraments is surely the recitation of the 6 great questions, often delivered with a demanding or even entitlement passion. Who? What? When? Where? How? Why? Sometimes we compound these questions into massive inquiries like, who knew how much of what by when? Usually we keep it simple, using a single line of inquiry, often in the form of an accusation. Who is responsible for this mess? What did you think you were doing? When are you going to get around to doing the things you promised to do? Where do you think you are? How did this happen? All I want to know is why. Can you give me just one good answer to why? Inquiries fly out toward all the targets of our projected ignorance, anger, responsibility. This inquisitive mode has been around for eons. In fact, back at the turning of the millennia, no, not 2000, not even 1000 of the Common Era, but in that age before Common Era became the Common Era, and numbers started adding up on calendars, and people didn't have to be confused by other calendars, this projective, inquisitive mode was already ancient. It was, in fact, getting pretty old. In that last century of the older times, many things were changing. The great axial age had swept the collective consciousness through about 200 years before, and those revolutionary ways of thinking had moved from speculation to acculturation. Against that backdrop of age-old questioning and cutting-edge thought patterns, an unexpected character emerged out of the ancient scholastic tradition of the yeshiva, the detailed examination and religious inquiry into the Torah. one of the rabbis, by whatever breakthrough of understanding, suddenly turned normal questions on their heads. You know the rabbi, and you know one of his famous sayings. If I'm not for myself, who is for me? If I'm for myself alone, what am I? If not now, when? In that simple challenge, the great questions were replaced with some unasked questions. So in Hillel's tradition, and his shadow, let's ask some unasked questions. Let's ask those questions that assume that the most important answers are not out there, but rather inside us, in our own beings. That life's greatest answers are always ultimately personal, and life's greatest collective answers will always grow from the personal to the transpersonal to the universal. Who? Let's ask instead, if not me, then who? How do I reconfigure any situation to focus on my own capability and responsibility? Interesting combination. Capability and responsibility. In the most trying of times, we often hear people challenged about why they didn't do more to make things better. They often answer that they were not in a position to make a big difference, that others were the ones who could have changed the course of affairs. But we are reminded by Edward Everett Hale, I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. Unless you have no capabilities, it is you who is the who. And our moral heritage, flowing out of our humanist tradition, reminds us that our capabilities imply a responsibility to use our capabilities in the common good. As John Donne reminds us all, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. What? It might be tempting to transform this into, say what? But let's instead ask, what else? The usual response to a what question is a limitation. For example, what are we having for lunch? Now, if I were to respond iced tea, you might get the impression of a very light lunch, especially if the response is taken as total and complete. However, when it comes to lunch, we generally know that it's unlikely to be just iced tea, even if we are dieting. We know, or at least we hope, there will be more. Yet so often in life, we let much more important, more complex questions of what to be answered simplistically and superficially. What is your life plan? Often is answered as if find a job, graduate from high school is enough of an answer. Iced tea for lunch will get probed, but a person's thoughts about life is simply accepted. Likewise, when we explore something like, what do you believe? If we truly want to ask the question and are not simply engaging in polite conversation, or more likely attempting to establish a platform for our own polemic, we want to know more. When? Hillel has already posed the classic unasked question, if not now, when? Which might be restated as, why not now? Time is a slippery thing. We suppose it to be made of discrete and concrete elements, of seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, years, centuries, millennia. But it's also composed of eras, ages, lives, manners, delays, dormant possibilities, and so much more. My grandmother Becker, asked about when we might do something, would routinely reply, we'll see, and thereby cast time into the realm of choice and perception. Every time behind us is filtered memory. Every time ahead is speculative. The very question of when shifts us from reality into either nostalgia, even if it's sort of bandied about as history, or reverie, both excuses for not engaging something in the present. The next occasion that an action or decision is put off for another time, see what happens if you ask the unasked question, well, why not now? Yes, there may appear to be valid reasons for not doing it presently, yet who knows if the flow of circumstance will be the same as the flow of supposition into the future. When others want to put it off till then, ask them, why not now? Too many of us know people, maybe even ourselves, for whom the bucket list of life is saved for a time when, and who knows if that time when will ever arrive, or if life is what occurs while you wait for then to become now. Carpe diem. Where? The obvious corollary to if not now when is the provocative if not now here, where? One of the recurring themes of religions has always been an otherworldliness. Whether we are talking about spiritual or physical states of being, nirvana, the land of milk and honey, heaven, Eden, and all such conditions of fulfillment as are elsewhere, you have to leave here to get there. Where is never answered by the ever-present here. It's always somewhere else. Yet one of the recurring themes of all the great religious teachers has been that if it isn't here, at least nascently, it won't be somewhere else either. Such wisdom of the work of the world has consistently been edited out of the precepts when they are transformed from spiritual to religious. What the prophets, the Buddha, the sages, the gurus, the shaman placed clearly in our hearts, minds, spirits, and bodies, the institutions of religion transformed into unattainable promises of somewhere else for those who are trapped here. But out of the most oppressed, out of the most denied, has always come a vision of ultimates contained in us, in our situations, and not somewhere else. The classic tale of slave liberation, the people could fly, tells of blacks rising up not to heaven, not in heaven, but in the fields under the lash. More than one of the parables by the Rabbi of Nazareth spoke of transformation in the most unlikely places. A consistent message is that if any promise is not available here, then it's not available anywhere. When those of us in the free religious tradition speak about the unity of all existence, this is what we mean. That there aren't different rules that apply in different places. And our problem is not one of location, in other words, not a problem of where, but of perception, of seeing what is here. How? Usually the question of how finds receptive response with an answer of either history or supplies. History binds us to what has already occurred, both as possibility and limitation. Supplies limit us to perceived resources. I'm reminded of a friend who had a summer home near me. Every 2 to 3 years she would renew her deck coatings. She would always use the same stain compound, always bemoan how it wore out, swear at how it needed to be applied, etc., etc., etc. But over decades, she would do it again using the same product. Until one day, when the product became unavailable, and she sought the advice of the paint expert. She asked for a good replacement for the old product, and was told there was no replacement for it, because everything now lasted so much longer, was much less toxic, and easier to apply. Her habitual asking and answering of how had held her back. So let's learn to ask how else as an alternative inquiry. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, one thing we know is that the best response to the question of how will always come If we have the most diverse group, feel free to look at all the possibilities rather than just certainties. The best how question becomes, who is not here who could help in thinking about this? The second best how question then becomes, what haven't we considered yet? And the third best how question becomes, why not? Which brings us to the ultimate question, why? Now the assumption might be that the unasked question is why not? But that was just used as a question of meaning around the idea of how. Rather, the unasked question is why indeed? Asked consistently and repeatedly, drilling down below the surface of any situation, seeking its core. Let's take a situation very close to home and very close in time. In a few minutes, our collection bowls will be passed. Why? Some might say because that is an element of our worship here. Others might suggest that it has to do with the innate need of human beings to give back to the abundance of life. Our worship leader, who is also our treasurer, would probably want to remind us that this congregation has bills to pay. But why? We have bills to pay because we have decided as a congregation to support diverse programs such as ministry, religious education, music. But why? We support those programs because we believe that they are inclusive, more universal, more empowering, more liberating, more just, more respectful values than are represented by any other organized community in Key West. But why? Because we believe in the promising but as yet unfulfilled potential for good inherent in each person and made manifest in community. We believe we must be active advocates for that already but not yet world of the here and now, of us and not others, that can reach beyond habit and tradition, beyond pride and prejudice, beyond iniquity and injustice. But why? Because we would rather be helpful and hopeful than discouraged and disappointed. We would rather be constructive than merely critical, be caring rather than despairing, creative rather than merely reactive, faithful rather than faint of heart. So why do we pass those baskets? To know why, you have to dig deep. Ask the why question even when it has been answered, until the core values are revealed and not just the surface conditions. To not settle for the arid dryness of the deserts of life, but to drill down, way down, to where the waters of meaning flow free and pure and sparkle with unimagined but hoped-for brilliance. Who, what, when, where, how, why are the questions that are often asked. But let's remember to ask the unasked questions. If not you, who? What else? Why not now? If not here, where? How else? And why? There are more answers out there than we can possibly imagine. But by being who we are, where we are, doing what we do, with what we have, when we have it, and then asking the unasked questions, the possibilities grow to the immensity of all, and we remember that the abundance of everything is ours simply for the asking.